Even if you had survival skills comparable to those of Bear Grylls, the Wild West would probably kill you before the end of your first year. This was the era of rampant disease and complete vulnerability to the elements. Every cougar and creature was out to get you, and then we're not even getting to the people. Besides hostile Native Americans, you still had the bandits to look out for. And these were not the meanies depicted by Looney Tunes. Yosemite Sam would quake in his rootin' boots at the sight of these bloodthirsty outlaws that ran down entire towns. And speaking of boots, even your shoes could kill you. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's start with the smallest of the criminals, the germs, and work our way up to those deadly boots as we look into the many ways that the untamed frontier could kill you. Diseases and injuries. Let's say you did manage to make the months-long voyage with no running water and feces staining the decks of your ship. Well, now you are in the New World. Those first few settlers actually had the best of sanitary conditions because there were still so few of them around that it was just easier to keep themselves clean and maintain a pretty decent grooming schedule. But once towns started springing up, well, the amount of open sewage and human garbage had a tendency to pile up as the population grew. In those days, basic plumbing consisted of people dumping the contents of their night pots straight out of the window. You were literally slogging through poop on your way to work in the morning, or you were drinking it because that was another option to get rid of waste, just dump it in the river. Then there's the fact that hauling water with buckets was a tedious and time-consuming task, so water was reused in 1,000 different ways to save time. Dishwater was thrown straight onto the floor. This helped to compact dirt floors and keep dust from rising up and settling on your clothes and food. And when it came to bathing, it was a common belief that it was unhygienic to bathe at all. Those protective oils your skin built up after weeks of riding horses, grinding corn by hand, and working the fields, well, all that grime was just nature's way of keeping you safe. So, when the once-a-month ordeal was finally taken to bathe, it was a family affair. Starting with the eldest members of the family, everyone would use a single bucket of water to wash. By the time the littlest members of the household got their turn, the water was so grimy and soiled that that's where we got the saying, throwing the baby out with the bathwater from. Dishes weren't washed. They were wiped clean with rags that saw about as much soap as their human handlers did. Heck, communal rags to wipe your mouth and clean up food were left out on the counters in saloons for everyone to use. If you didn't catch cholera in these conditions at least once before your teens, it would be a miracle. Germs just weren't a thing. It wasn't until the late 1800s that the theory was even proposed that the microscopic creatures could be the cause of illnesses and the gangrene that led to the deaths of countless soldiers. Side note, it was the discovery of germs that gave Johnson & Johnson's their first million when they imposed sanitary conditions in operating rooms for the Spanish-American War. Dysentery, diphtheria, and cholera were more feared than the outlaws. If cholera spreads through your town, you could expect 50% of the population to die in the next few weeks. Hygiene and dirty water aside, you still had all sorts of crotch rot to consider too. Pubic lice and gonorrhea were already running wild among the ships and brothels, but the Americas had its own special strain of tropical venereal disease for the Europeans to catch, a killer called syphilis. If it hadn't metastasized to your brain before it killed you, then the mercury you were given would drive you mad. And then the poison and the disease could work together to kill you so much faster. Medicine and treatment. Since we are on the subject of medicines that could kill you, let's get into those. Say you lived in a town where there was an outbreak of cholera, infectious boils, or heaven forbid, something even worse, like leprosy or rabies. You had 3 options at your disposal: pray and hope for the best, wait for a caravan with a traveling doctor to pass by, or go to your local barber. Yep, you heard that right. The guy who cut your hair could pull a rotten tooth, reset a bone, and prescribe you all sorts of insane remedies. In all fairness, they worked closely alongside the traveling doctors, who sold most of their cures to the barbers in the first place. You see, in the 1700s, being a doctor didn't carry the prestige it does today. Since these men robbed graves to study human anatomy, performed the bloody task of amputating limbs, and treated your grandma's butt boils, their job was one of the most disgusting and looked down upon of all of the traits. They traveled in caravans filled with herbs and ground-up mummy ashes to heal the sick, and before they left, the barbers bought up their stocks to treat the townspeople until the next one came along. Talismans to ward off evil spirits, and heavy metals like mercury and white lead treated everything from cancerous tumors to gum disease. Then there were the poppy seed concoctions, which were as strong as street-grade heroin is today, that were given to colicky babies and elderly patients with gastronomical issues. Amputated limbs were burned with hot pokers while the patients were still awake, and urine washes were kept at hand for infected eyes. If none of these killed you, then there are always the perfectly good medicinal herbs that were wrapped in horse dung for a few days before being applied directly to open wounds and stewed into tea for you to drink. And our favorite and most unpleasant of the lot, meat enemas to get rid of parasites. A piece of raw meat was tied to a string, pushed up as far as it could go, and after a good few days inside to putrefy nice and good, it was pulled out, in the hopes that the worms nested in the meat instead of your bowels. The weather. After being subjected to these deadly cures, we'd presume that you'd flee as far north as you could to avoid the doctors, or being drafted into another war, where there was no shortage of dung compresses and hot poker amputations. But now you'd face frostbite, wolves, bears, and cougars. This brings us to those boots we mentioned before. Besides the fact that you could be gunned down for a good pair of boots, they also insulated you against the cold. This becomes a problem when you're sleeping in temporary tents and drafty houses in the middle of the cold Dakota winters. Taking off your shoes will have your feet taken by frostbite, so shoes were kept on for months and months at a time. A tiny bruise or boil on your toe has all the time in the world to soak up your sweat and the muddy sleet you're trekking through. Then the cold numbs your extremities, and you don't feel an infection starting to brew underneath that leather. Gangrene sets in without you even knowing it, and when the spring arrives and you finally get to take off your shoes, the whole foot comes off with the boot in a green, slimy mess that used to be a limb that was attached to you. You probably think that this colorful description is a 1 in a million occurrence, but actually it happened pretty often. Especially when soldiers were out in the winter and were forced to sleep in their full attire. Gangrene was a death sentence. Buying time by amputating the limb wasn't even an option. The infection was all over the body by that time. It's not like you had antibiotics to save you, but you could always wrap yourself in cabbage leaves and have a dose of some poppy. At least you'll be pain-free and high as a kite in your final convulsing moments. The people. Now let's get to the people. After half the population was killed off by the various diseases and treatments that could possibly afflict them, you'd think that the people would place a little more value in the ones that did manage to make it to their teenage years. But no, people have always been the biggest contributor to global mortality rates, and they will forever be. Cowboys didn't have those cinematic duels for honor and justice that the movies like to depict. These drunken duels had no lightning-fast pistols that were drawn from intricately carved leather chaps. The duelists were almost always so intoxicated that they rarely died from the gunfire themselves, but they sure shot plenty of innocent bystanders. And if someone had a gun or could manage to steal one, you can bet they were going to get as much out of it as possible. Bloodthirsty criminals were everywhere. John Wesley Hardin once shot a man for snoring too loud. He killed around 40 men in his day. The Harp brothers probably killed hundreds of people, including some of their own children that they had with the 3 women that they held hostage for decades. Cherokee Bill Goldsby, Butch Cassidy and his Wild Bunch, Jesse James, the Reynolds Gang, Ma Barker and her delinquent sons, their crimes and the trail of blood they left behind them have been told countless times. They were so vicious that their names will forever be in the history books. The killers who didn't make the history books by name were the slave owners and the bands that hunted native tribes for state-funded bounties. Death is part of everyday life. Your death could come for you in the night for a pocket full of gold, or just because you farted in the tent that you were sharing with another criminal. Stealing a few heads of cattle held the same penalty as killing innocent travelers on the road did. Hangings, lynchings, and death by firing squad were doled out indiscriminately. If you didn't kill for a meal, you'd starve. But if you did and you got caught, you'd be dead anyway. Damned if you do, and damned if you don't. In the old days, it was every man for himself, and getting away with murder was easier than escaping the much more deadly germs and being drafted into another war you didn't ask for. Let us know in the comments what other snippets from history you'd like us to cover next. And don't forget to like and subscribe before you leave. Until next time, cheers!